Cormac McCarthy's favorite author was Herman Melville, and his favorite book was Moby Dick. And Melville's influence on McCarthy goes much deeper than just inspiring him to continue writing in the King James literary style. But rather, as we're going to discuss today, Melville taught McCarthy about spirituality, the law, whales, and so much more. And my name is Ian, and on this channel, I release daily Cormac McCarthy scholarship for free because we need to take scholarship out of academia and bring it back to the people. So, one of the main texts we're going to be talking about today is McCarthy's unpublished screenplay, Whales and Men. And I just want to note for all you guys out there that the available Whales and Men PDF that's floating around online is just one of many drafts of McCarthy's Whales and Men. And it's actually one of the least juicy versions because in other versions that were written a bit earlier, McCarthy would sometimes rant about certain people or certain ideas more than that draft. And so a lot of the information we're going to be getting today for actually Whales and Men, The Stonemason, and Suttree are only available in the earlier drafts at the archive. And McCarthy's main spiritual thesis in Whales and Men that's directly inspired, as we're about to see because he mentions Melville, by Melville, is that when you kill whales, you are killing God. And McCarthy goes so far to even say that when God finally returns to Earth and starts communicating to us again, he's going to ask us, hey guys, have you figured out yet? Like, you guys don't need to ask me. Have you guys figured out that you can just go ask the whales about the meaning of God? Then McCarthy talks about how God starts flying around and looking and be like, wait, where are the whales? And he comes to us and he asks us, and we're kind of like, well, we use them to, get some grease and to feed dogs. And McCarthy feels, quote, that whales force us into theological metaphor. And another quote from McCarthy, I think that's why we kill them. I think their value as produce is secondary to their sacrificial value. It's our inadequacy to the overwhelming fact of the whale's existence that will doom the whale. I think Melville is right. It's like killing God. That whale's existence is the whale I can't deal with. That it is the whale who strings the world together on the vectors of his breath, and I won't know in this world where that whale will have gone when the last whale is slaughtered and hauled from the sea. So what McCarthy is saying here is that we are inadequate to deal with the Platonic ideal of the whale, the whaleness of a whale. And that our brains, having developed in this very logical way and in creating language in this society, moved in a totally opposite way of the whale. And this is where McCarthy starts to get real trippy with the whale stuff. Quote, I don't think you can say what death is if you don't know what life is. I don't know what the whale is. How can I talk about his non-existence? What is it that doesn't exist? I guess sometimes I try to think not what the whale is, but who he is. Maybe the way Melville did. I don't think science gets that done, but there are times when I see the whale very differently. And again, quote, Melville thought the whale was not God, but God's agent. Be the white whale principal or be the white whale agent, I will wreak that vengeance upon him. We've known for at least 3,000 years, at least since the Garden of Eden, that we would be destroyed by our desire to be God. And so this all kind of supports the idea of why McCarthy writes nature passages, the way that he does. That Christianity always likes to say God's in everything. But in Genesis, there was a division, later supported by Descartes and science, that there is a division between humans and the other kingdoms, the animal kingdom, the plant kingdom, and whatnot, because we have the higher intelligence. And so, of course, when you're at the top of the hierarchy, you can rule over the other domain however you want, in basically an unethical way. That's how most people see reality. But McCarthy puts nature into his works as a hidden character to put God's unconscious, as we've talked about many times before, within the work so that we can become conscious of the higher laws of life through the nature in his work. And he got all this from his love of German idealism, Schelling, Bohm, Fichte, even probably some Hegel. And then obviously just being someone who was in love with nature, because when you start getting in to nature and you start to transcend Christianity and whatnot, one of the things that, some of the pathways you start to take are obviously you move into Gnosticism. You look at the German idealists because they inspired Nietzsche and Schopenhauer, and then the postmodernists and Heidegger and all these other, really smart people who more or less correlate with the type of person who is going to want to escape Christianity and kind of have this return to nature. And that source material, and we could even throw Melville into this category, supports the actual phenomenological experience you're having on the ground with a contact of spiritual ecology. And once again, that's not possible if you are in that divide of humans over nature, and that God is infused in nature, and he's given us permission to kill nature. And McCarthy asks, I don't try to think what the whale is, but who he is. That it's literally giving and respecting the whale's sentience as this bigger ideal. And this is the right type of environmentalism. Everyone, blocks the road now, environmentalism, but gaining an phenomenological connection, gaining and experiencing contact with nature and starting to understand its sentience. If the majority of the world did that instead of focusing on materialistic pursuits or hierarchical religious pursuits, we would end up in a much better place, especially now that we've kind of transcended a lot of the faults of paganism. Everything is always moving forward in motion. And when I am imagining the evolution of our consciousness and where it could be, it's a very Melvillian, McCarthyian one that has a compassion for nature way beyond economics and back to just the moment. Because when we look at even like at the Garden of Eden, the animals were in communion with Adam and Eve. Noah gave names to the animals. He wasn't focused necessarily on what they were. Okay, let's get the what's done. But then there is a who aspect. And we like to project, a name and human emotions onto our domesticated pets, the dogs and the cats and whatnot. But to develop a spiritual connection with the totality of nature is a whole other program. And the stakes keep getting higher. We see Melville, and he's starting to play with some of these ideas for the first time, really ever, having this compassion for the whale. We, go through time and we see romanticism, the first wave, blow it up, the German romanticism, then eventually modernism and the Spanish symbolists. And then in the 60s, there was a revival. And there's people like McCarthy. And lately, we've had more of a political revival. There's been some indigenous revival on nature of this idea. But it's easy to watch the whaling show and be like, man, I feel bad for the whales, which was something that people really didn't care about, 200 years ago. They're monsters. But we've evolved in consciousness. So what's the higher stake now? What's going on, what McCarthy was doing? What happens when you reflect on nature's unconscious and you become conscious early in your life, and then you have decades to take action with that? And the way you start doing that is starting to ask who, not what. Transcending logic, and there's some logic bros out there right now. They're and all I have to say is good luck. So that's the Whales and Men analysis. McCarthy really takes Melville to the next level. And McCarthy was very into whales in the 80s. He actually copy edited Robert Payne's book, Among the Whales. So if anyone would like to read a Cormac McCarthy edited book that isn't a Lawrence Krauss book, that is probably more fun than Lawrence Krauss book, then go check out Among the Whales. I haven't read that one yet. And so now we're moving on to Melville's influence on the stonemason, which is very small. And McCarthy mentions Melville very slightly on a certain page, and there really is no connection except maybe to some of the things that he was writing on the page in a Melvillian way. Because the stonemason is very interesting because McCarthy, much like Carl Jung and Robinson Jeffers, who I have videos on, was inspired by stonemasonry not as a artesian or architectural pursuit, but as a spiritual one. And this all stems obviously back to things like Hiram Abiff building the Temple of Solomon and Freemasonry, and all the very beautiful metaphors embedded in all of that. And so McCarthy played his hand. So you kind of actually see McCarthy moving on some of these classical ideas and like saying, okay, I'm going to take this to the next level, which is what you need to do. For all my writers out there, this is what I'm trying to do. You look at this idea and you say, okay, I'm going to try to make this better. I'm going to try to be the next person. And so I say this all the time. I get 5 novels a week sent to me that I usually delete. Sometimes I'll look at them because I say, don't send me your novels. I don't have enough time for this. But sometimes I look, and I've never seen one that has taken whatever author they're inspired by or like idea they're inspired by to the next level. Like that's the standard that I'm trying to reach, hopefully, when I release something out there. And there's something to be said for free works or getting started and doing your first things. And like, you're not going to write better, but you can make the idea better. You can make some progress, and it will show through your ambition. through how much you care about it. Because if you care about spreading an idea enough, you will get the skills. You'll spend 1,000 hours or so to, become a good writer in terms of style and an energy to make people interested in what the hell you're talking about. Enough on that, though. Let's look at these quotes from the stonemason. The first one being, quote, that God made the stones flat so that they could be placed so to make houses for his bodies and temples for his soul. Or he made beings with just such bodies and just such souls to require just such stones, end quote. And another quote, the gravity is in the stone and it makes you strong. Flesh needs stone, something to come to grips with, something that in resisting so firmly being shaped does shape the shaper. For all true masons are formed by their calling. They assume such shapes as suit life. And I'm going to be actually making a video very, very soon on Cormac McCarthy and Freemasonry. I'm gathering stuff, but the influence here is obvious. We'll get into that later in the other video. Okay, so I think that the first big connection here, more in the first quote, to Moby Dick, is that the shaping of stones is not just a task. It actually shapes you in return. And when we look at Moby Dick, that's what the main character starts to come to, that whaling is not just a job, that it's a spiritual endeavor that also affects you, so much so that we see Captain Ahab just, going ballistic because of how the whales have affected him. And these whale beings, these who are these this platonic ideal of God or whatever McCarthy thinks, has to have a major impact on us. And so does the shaping of stones because it's dealing with sacred geometry and whatnot. And so kind of taking that a step further, though, like the spiritual connection and metaphor of the gravity in stone and making us strong is just a very simple connection to Melville's idea of our relationship to nature in a spiritual way. McCarthy explains through the stone. Melville is explaining through the whale. The other big idea that is being explored here is this kind of quest that it takes to gain spirituality. A lot of people think, hey, I just go do the ayahuasca or, lay down, do a little meditation. I'm going to gain enlightenment. But in stonemasonry, as a spiritual art or whaling, it is a much deeper calling. It is a quest to go find this elusiveness. We could say that is the metaphor of Moby Dick. And it's really an existential search because the stonemason grapples with the existential weight of using his body to build while, it's forming his soul. And Melville's characters are, all going through these existential crises in terms of their obsessions and their fears and their desires to be able to get the white whale. And so I think there's some powerful stuff there. And I think that's kind of why that page is loaded. When I looked at my copy of the Stonemason, like there's philosophy kind of interspersed all throughout it, like the philosophy of stonemasonry. But that page has got some pretty heavy stuff. And it's, I don't think any accident that he wrote Melville as an inspiration. That kind of seems to be his technique while drafting, that he'll be writing and he'll be like, okay, I'm evoking this person now. And that is a testament to being well read, because if you haven't read very much, which is once again a common problem of a lot of people's novels I'm being sent, that you can't evoke like, okay, I remember this, like I remember this passage, like I'm going to bring them into the picture right now. Like that's a great idea, especially as a beginning writer. McCarthy was doing this after he wrote Blood Meridian. Or actually this was while he was writing Blood Meridian, but still, this shows you about being humble. So let's move on to Suttree and Blood Meridian, which are really kind of one novel because McCarthy was working on them simultaneously for years. And a great line from Blood Meridian that was directly inspired by Melville goes, quote, each man scanned the terrain and the movements of the least of the creatures were logged into their collective cognizance until they were federated with invisible wires of vigilance and advanced upon that landscape with a single resonance. We also know McCarthy was reading Melville and thinking about him in some of the early drafts of Suttree, which kind of go back to the 1960s, because he just wrote random notes that no one has really connected yet on Melville. So we can see that influence is there. So some of the other major things, now that we're kind of moving away from the scholarly stuff, that I've noticed how from Melville on influencing McCarthy, is that both are really into this idea of the grand narrative, of this epic drama. When we look at Blood Meridian, which is very much like Moby Dick in the sense that it's set on this grand stage. And its main idea is, tackling these existential questions and these big moral concepts through kind of these complex and morally ambiguous characters. Like Captain Ahab is placed in this situation, and I think he does have compassion toward his crew and to certain things, and I think at one point was a good person, but is now somewhat shifted. But he's in this complex scenario. It's ever-changing, dealing with mutinies and whatnot, and we could say that Judge Holden and the kid and whatnot are the same way. Obviously, as I talked about earlier, both are very into the use of nature and the sublime and kind of using nature imagery as a form of symbolism. McCarthy doesn't really have anything, maybe like the fire in the road, which doesn't really count. That's overt in terms of symbolism as the white whale. But his general use of nature and stories and whatnot has a heavy focus on symbolism. And when you look at books like Outer Dark, Suttree, The Crossing, and Blood Meridian, there's a lot of heavy symbolism in there, which is somewhat rare. You go read an Ernest Hemingway book or a Proust book, there's not much symbolism going on there in terms of like occult or nature based symbolism. Obviously, both explore very similar philosophical and theological ideas. And last but not least, when you read Moby Dick, you're like, this is nothing like McCarthy. But when you look at the lineage and how it kind of moved toward McCarthy and who Melville inspired, especially in the fiction writing world, I don't know who McCarthy, because Melville kind of inspired Hemingway. I don't know who we could turn to as a bigger inspiration at in the classical sense, because obviously Faulkner was a big inspiration, and Faulkner was also a huge fan of Melville, and said that if someone asked him if he could write any book, what book would he have written in classic literature, and he said Moby Dick. And we don't really cover Faulkner very much on this channel, but Faulkner actually used a lot more literary techniques than McCarthy did from Melville, because he was somewhat closer in time and had a little bit less to work with, because he started writing in the late 1920s, early 30s, or at least publishing his most famous novels, some of which have very, Christian inspired metaphors, just like Moby Dick. So if you guys enjoyed this video, subscribe. You can always get some Cormac McCarthy t-shirts, gear at the link below, or join the Cormac McCarthy course for $5 a month. There's over 13 hours of content and a ton more coming soon. And I will see you guys in the next video. Peace.